Welcome back, everyone. If you've been keeping up with the smaller portions of this webinar, then you know that we're discussing equitable grading practices. I began the conversation by exploring some different considerations for those of you who are interested in moving in this direction. We also discussed the importance of alignment, how to better achieve it inside of a course, and how we might use a balance of formative and summative assessments to create a more equitable grading system. This segment is going to focus on how we might make all of this work a little bit better inside of Blackboard and inside of a system that has commonly focused on more traditional and perhaps less equitable grading practices. I'm going to share my screen. And in doing so, you're going to see slides, which you also should have access to on the ID On Demand website. I'll be honest though, I'm not really going to be using these slides much in this particular chunk of our conversation. What I really want to do is have the opportunity to demonstrate how we might use Gradebook a little bit differently. And the slides can support your review when you have to go back and look at this and remember what it is I said. Here we have just a sample course that I've created inside of Blackboard Ultra. And what we have here, of course, are my midterm and final projects, and they're living inside of their own module. In my previous conversation, I talked about the fact that we could fold opportunities for lesson by lesson formative assessment into our instruction, and that we might document student progress toward learning outcomes this way. I mentioned how those granular formative assessments that are happening very frequently, hopefully each time that we're teaching, that those are not necessarily graded because those are opportunities for first practice for learners. And so once they've had the opportunity to practice those learning targets and pursue those outcomes, more than once, and they've had the opportunity to receive your feedback, and they've had time to change their thinking and their learning and their work, we can give a module assessment that still functions formatively because it's informing our instruction ahead of a bigger exam like a midterm or a final. But because students have had ample opportunity for practice, we can also take grades. How we take grades, though, is something that I'm hoping I can push thinking around a little bit. So we're going to open a course module where I have actually hidden an assessment. So here in week 1, my module includes my preparation materials, but it also includes what I'm calling course level objective 1A module assessment. Now, why would I call it that? If you were hanging out with me in a previous conversation, then you know that when we look at my outcomes and learning targets, one of my course level outcomes, which you can see on this slide, is that learners will identify and define languages, dialects, and varieties. However, that's a huge course level outcome that can't be taught in a single session. And even my module outcomes 1A, B, and C, they're pretty huge as well. So I broke them into even smaller lesson learning targets. Here inside of my course, I've created for module 1 an assessment of just 1A. I might create a different assessment for module outcomes 1B and C as well. But for our demonstration purposes, we're just going to look at this module level assessment. The first thing that I want you to notice is that I named it CLO 1A module assessment. This allows me to make my alignment to the standards transparent, and it communicates something that I value very much. I'm not just assessing whether or not you mastered the content that I taught. I'm assessing your progress toward this course level outcome. And this particular bit of content, the questions that are aligned here, they align to module level outcome 1A, target 2, and 1A, target 1 from this alignment document. We're focusing on identifying and defining languages. These discrete skills live inside of our module outcome, but I've broken them down even further and I'm assessing them in a far more discrete way. I'm also making it very clear to myself as a good reminder, especially if I'm documenting around progress toward the standards, and my students, which module level outcomes I'm attending to. You'll notice that the questions that I'm asking align to the verbs that are in those outcomes as well. If you look over here on my assessment settings, you'll notice that I've created a category called CLO1, Course Level Objective 1. Because of course, there will be other module assessments and more summative assessments that I offer that will include items that align to this particular standard. I've created this grading category because all of the questions that I'm asking on this assessment, they align to that course level outcome. This poses a good challenge for instructors. It challenges you to design your assessments around your outcomes and not necessarily just around an event or a moment in time. This would require you then to item map, just as I have, midterms, final exams, more significant assessments that might include far more items than I have here. It would require you to take multiple grades on those items as well. If we're moving toward more equitable grading practices, I recommend using letter grades, not necessarily points or percentages. Depending on where you're sitting with your assessments, you might want to allow multiple attempts as well. If you're interested in creating categories for your grades, you can do that by accessing your gradebook and then clicking on the settings wheel in the upper left-hand corner. Here, you can move through your grading schemas and add new categories. My course, for instance, might have 5 outcomes. I've added those categories accordingly. If I have an assessment that has 50 items on it, I might actually break that down into 5 different components, and I might grade each of them and report on them a little bit separately so that I can study progress toward these particular outcomes far more carefully and in a much more discrete way. I've shared this particular process and screenshots on the slides that I'll be sharing with all of you inside of the ID website. Here you can see how to define your categories, how to align your module assessment title and names with your course level outcomes, and how to adjust your assessment settings so that you can begin doing a better job pursuing equity and alignment with your students. This is the example of my targeted formative assessment. By making the alignment transparent, item by item, it makes me a far better diagnostician. It can also inform my instruction, the feedback that I give to learners, and the adjustments that they make as they try to do better and grow over time. The next section of this particular webinar will focus on the use of integer scales and the role that documentation might play inside of a course that is aligning to more equitable grading and feedback processes.